4 years ago, I climbed into my pickup truck with almost no money to my name, and I drove. I wasn't trying to get anywhere, I was trying to think. Eventually, I found myself sitting beside the river. For anybody here in Georgia, that's the Ogeechee River. I shut the truck off, rolled the windows down, and just sat there staring out across the water. And I remember asking myself one question: what am I going to do now? Everything that I'd spent years building, my marriage, my home, my business, the future I thought I was going to have, it all had disappeared. I didn't have a plan, and I didn't have any other place to go. I honestly had no idea what tomorrow was going to look like. And looking back at it, I didn't realize it then, but I was sitting in the first hour of the rest of my life. Over the last 4 months, I've shared more than 100 conversations with all of you. We've talked about peace, money, freedom, loneliness, dating, boundaries, ab- emotional abuse, narcissism, health, purpose. In just about every lesson rebuilding my life has taught me so far. But I realized something. Those conversations were almost never told in the order that they happened. They were told as the lessons came to me. So today, I want to take you back to where all of those lessons actually began. Because after yesterday's video, I've read hundreds of comments from people saying they're standing exactly where I was. Some of you left a few days ago, and some of you are trying to figure out how you're ever going to make it on your own. And some of you are still trying to decide whether you should leave at all because you're scared. Where do I even start? Well, I can't answer that for you, but I can tell you where I started. It wasn't with a financial plan, it wasn't another job, and it wasn't rebuilding my credit. The first thing that I did was finally admit to myself that I'd had enough. That's the starting spot right there. That decision had been building in me for years. I'd negotiated with the truth, made excuses, told myself tomorrow would somehow be different or better, until that one day I realized that tomorrow was just going to look exactly like yesterday, unless I changed it. So there I sat, by that river, thinking. Then a thought crossed my mind. I remember saying to myself, and I remember saying it out loud, well, I could always live in my truck. And, that probably sounds crazy. But once I accepted that, my mind finally started slowing down. I've spent my life hunting and fishing and camping and learning how to survive. I knew if it ever came right down to it, that I could disappear into the South Georgia swamps with nothing more than a pocket knife, and I could survive if I absolutely had to. But then another thought hit me. Who in the hell wants to be doing that at 51 years old? I wasn't 20 years old anymore. I wasn't looking for an adventure. I wasn't trying to prove how tough I was. I'd spent my whole life working, building, trying to create a future. And now I was sitting beside a river, wondering if my backup plan was surviving in the woods. But that's when another thought came to me. You know, I remembered an 80-year-old woman that I've known for years, and she has a heart of gold. Life had never been very kind to her. But over the years, I'd done quite a bit of work for her. And most of the time, I'd only charge, her what it cost me because I knew she couldn't afford much more than that. And I genuinely liked her. She owned 10 acres, the same 10 acres that I'm sitting on today. And I remember thinking, maybe she'd let me park my truck there for a while I figure my life out. And that was it. That was my whole plan right then. Not rebuilding my life, not replacing everything I'd lost, just finding somewhere safe to park my truck. So I put the truck in gear and I drove to her house. No, I wasn't about to ask something, like that over the phone. I believe conversations, well, some conversations deserve to happen face to face. A handshake still means something to me. I found her outside in we talked for a while and I told her everything that had happened. No BS, just truth. And I told her that I didn't know what the hell I was going to do next. Then I asked her, would you mind if I parked my truck here for a little while until I could get my feet back under me? And she smiled and said, take all the time you need. And I thanked her, shook her hand, and got back in my truck, and I drove through that gate. At the time, I thought I was just looking for somewhere to park my truck. But looking back at it, I was driving away from the life that I thought I wanted and towards the life I actually needed. I just didn't know it yet. So, anyways, I drive through the gate and I found a shady spot underneath a big old live oak tree. And I backed my truck in, shut the engine off, and I just sat there. I remember looking around thinking, I guess this is home for now. And that sentence still seems unbelievable to me. 51 years old, and after working my whole life, after building a very successful business, and after owning a beautiful home, my home was now the front seat of a pickup truck parked under a live oak tree. If you'd have told me a year earlier that that's where I'd end up, I'd have called you crazy. You know, but nothing around me had really changed. I still didn't have any money. I still didn't know what tomorrow was going to bring. I still didn't know if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But something inside me had changed. For the first time that day, I wasn't trying to solve the rest of my life. I wasn't trying to figure out how I was going to rebuild my business. And I wasn't trying to figure out where I would be 5 years from now. I was only trying to solve today. And I finally had. Looking back, that was the moment everything started to change. Not because my circumstances changed. They didn't. I still had almost no money. I still had no home. I still had no real plan. But what changed was what I thought I needed. For most of my life, I believed exactly what most people believe. The answer is more money, a bigger paycheck, a bigger house, a newer truck, more, 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 more. Because you know what? That's what we were taught. Work harder, earn more, buy more, upgrade everything, and stay on the hamster wheel. Then one day, my whole life fell apart. And suddenly, I couldn't play that game anymore. At first, I thought that meant I failed. But sitting under that old live oak, you know, something slowly started changing. The simpler that my life became, the quieter it became. The quieter it became, the more clearly I could think. And for the first time in years, nobody was screaming. Nobody was creating chaos. Nobody was telling me I wasn't enough. I could hear the wind. I could hear the birds. And for the first time in a very long time, I could hear myself think. That's when I slowly started realizing something else. Just maybe, I didn't need nearly as much as I'd spent my whole life believing I did. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that money doesn't matter. It does. And I'd still like to build a small house on this property one day. I've still got projects I want to finish. I'd still like to travel more. I'd like to leave something behind for my kids. Money absolutely makes some things better or easier. But here's what I've discovered. Money wasn't rebuilding my life. Peace was. Because once I finally had that peace, I stopped chasing things that I didn't really need. I stopped trying to impress people who weren't living my life. And I stopped measuring success by the size of a house. Keep doing that. See where it gets you. And or even the balance in my bank account. I started measuring it differently. Can I sleep at night? Can I look at myself in the mirror? Can I spend time with my kids? Real time. Can I wake up without chaos? And the answer was yes. I'm richer than I ever realized. I'm still rebuilding today. This old place still needs a lot of work. I still only bring home about $1,800 a month. Sometimes I save for months just to buy the materials for one project. Sometimes I get crafty and scrounge them up. But you know what? I'm okay with that. Because every project I finish, every tree I clear, and every little improvement that I make is mine. Mine. It wasn't bought with debt. It wasn't bought trying to impress somebody else. It was earned. One paycheck at a time. Yesterday, I read so many comments on that last video from people saying, I'm 12 days into this. I just left. I'm scared. I don't know how I'm going to make it. I wish I could sit down with every one of you. Not because I have all the answers. I don't. I'm still rebuilding myself. But I would tell you this, and I would believe this. Don't let fear convince you that you need to have everything before you begin. Because if I'd believed that, I'd still be sitting in a life that was destroying me. 4 years ago, all I really had was a pickup truck and a handshake from an 80-year-old woman with a heart of gold in a shady spot beneath a live oak tree. And enough hope to believe that I could make it through just one more day. Everything else has been built from there. One day, one decision, one paycheck, one project at a time. That's your answer. One thing at a time. You can't solve world problems in a broad scope. You can't. And that's exactly what I'm still doing today. Y'all, thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.